Unit 731, a military facility built to carry out extremely cruel and deadly experiments on human bodies, where some of the most horrifying experiments in history took place. This was Unit 731, established by Japan in the 1930s. Here, prisoners were subjected to biological weapon tests. Some were injected with the plague, others were frozen alive and then thawed, and surgeries were even performed without anesthesia. The sole goal was to gather data for warfare and to study the human body. Thousands of people suffered and died in unimaginable ways during these experiments, enduring relentless torture. Yet after the war, many of the scientists responsible were never brought to justice. Instead, they were protected by the United States in exchange for their research. Isn't it shocking how cruel and unjust this all was? Unit 731 drew worldwide condemnation and led to an international ban on such experiments. Sadly, it didn't stop far more horrific experiments, and I'll reveal those as this video goes on. Nazi twin experiments. Imagine this: you and your sibling are chosen for brutal experiments by a deranged doctor, only because you share the same birthday. During World War II, at the Auschwitz concentration camp, Nazi doctor Josef Mengele carried out some of the most inhumane experiments ever recorded, focusing especially on twins. His aim was to study genetic differences and to engineer a so-called superior race that fit Nazi ideology. Children had chemicals injected into their eyes in an attempt to change their color. Autopsies were performed to compare organs. Some twins were even sewn together, and when one sibling died, the other was often killed and dissected soon after. These experiments resembled torture far more than science, and none of the results ever had any real scientific value. Tens of thousands of children became victims of this nightmare. Mengele would be remembered in history as the Angel of Death. What he did was so horrific that after the war, strict international agreements were put in place to ban such practices forever. But here's the question: even for the sake of scientific progress, could inflicting such suffering on innocent children ever be acceptable? High-altitude pressure experiments, Dachau. Imagine being trapped inside a sealed chamber as the pressure steadily drops. At first, every breath grows harder and harder. Then suddenly, you feel your eardrums tear and the blood vessels in your brain start to rupture. During World War II, Nazi officials in Dachau and other camps used vacuum chambers to simulate extreme altitude and low-pressure conditions, forcing prisoners to serve as test subjects. Their goal was to study how sudden drops in pressure would affect pilots flying at high altitudes, and to turn that knowledge into a military advantage. Inside those chambers, the pressure was rapidly reduced. Eardrums ruptured, lungs bled, brain tissue was damaged. Some victims lost consciousness. Others never came out alive. Horrifying, isn't it, even just to imagine? After the war, these experiments were prosecuted as crimes against humanity, and such practices were permanently banned worldwide. The Guatemala syphilis experiments. How would you feel if you found out that a government secretly infected its own people with deadly diseases? Between 1946 and 1948, American researchers carried out hidden experiments in Guatemala. Thousands of people were deliberately exposed to sexually transmitted infections like syphilis and gonorrhea. Soldiers, prisoners, and even children in orphanages were turned into test subjects. The official goal was to study whether antibiotics could offer protection. But here's the horrifying truth: most of the subjects were never told what was happening, never given proper treatment, and were left to suffer for years. Because of these violations, such practices were later banned worldwide, and this episode is now remembered as one of the darkest chapters in human history. When the truth finally came to light decades later, the damage had already spread across generations. Even the grandchildren of victims carried the painful legacy of what had been done. To betray your own citizens like this, isn't that one of the greatest crimes a government can commit? Mustard gas experiments. Imagine being locked in a room, breathing normally, until minutes later, your throat ignites with unbearable pain. In the 1940s, during World War II, hundreds of soldiers were subjected to exactly this kind of experiment. The United States and Britain secretly used their own troops as test subjects to study the effects of mustard gas. Young men were sealed inside gas chambers. Within minutes, their skin blistered, their lungs burned, and every breath turned into agony. The shocking purpose behind these trials was to determine which ethnic groups might be more resistant to chemical weapons. These soldiers had volunteered to fight for their countries, yet they were betrayed by the very governments they served. Years later, when the documents came to light, all that remained were shattered lives and official silence. So tell me, Can we really excuse governments that did this to their own soldiers by claiming it was for science? Project Sunshine. Imagine this, a government secretly collecting the bones of dead children for a scientific project. And no, this isn't the plot of some dark movie, it really happened. In the 1950s, the United States launched a covert program known as Project Sunshine to investigate the effects of radiation from nuclear tests. The aim was to measure how the radioactive isotope strontium-90 affected the human body. To do that, bones and tissues, often from deceased infants, were secretly gathered from across the world. Families were never told. Their consent was never asked. The raw grief of parents who had just lost a child was exploited in the name of science. When the project was exposed, it triggered outrage, but by then, hundreds of tiny bodies had already been dissected. The scandal led to fierce debate and eventually to a ban on such practices. Yet some defended the government, arguing that since the infants were already dead, their remains could at least serve science. But think about it, if your baby had died and the state had stolen its body, tearing it apart with radiation, how would you feel? Human freezing experiment. Imagine being forced into a tub packed with ice, the kind of cold no human body can withstand for more than a few minutes. During World War II, Nazi doctors carried out brutal experiments to see how long soldiers could survive in extreme freezing conditions. Prisoners were submerged in icy water for hours, and when their bodies finally stopped shivering, scientists recorded how their organs began to fail. Some were pushed all the way to the point of freezing, then subjected to different reheating methods in attempts to revive them. Most did not survive this torture, and those who did were left with devastating, permanent damage. The supposed goal was to find ways to rescue pilots who crashed into freezing seas, but the methods were utterly inhumane, crossing every possible ethical boundary. That's why the human freezing experiments were banned as war crimes and are remembered today as some of the darkest violations ever committed in the name of science. Soviet sleep experiment. Imagine being forced to stay awake for days, never allowed to close your eyes. Sleep is forbidden. Every breath feels like a nightmare. In the 1940s, it was claimed that a secret Soviet laboratory conducted experiments on sleep deprivation. The goal was to see if soldiers could be turned into perfect warriors, able to fight without rest. 5 prisoners were locked inside a chamber and kept awake for days with a constant flow of stimulant gas. At first, there was laughter and casual conversation, but soon paranoia crept in. Hallucinations began. Violence followed. One by one, the subjects lost their minds. The records of this experiment were hidden in Soviet archives. Some say it's nothing more than an urban legend, others insist fragments of it are true. What is certain, however, is that such brutal treatment of the human mind and body led to it being banned on ethical grounds. If you had no choice but to be a subject in one of these experiments, which would you choose? Make sure to subscribe for more banned experiments.